Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer, and I hope you're doing very well today. Welcome to Modern Horizons 2 Speculation Part 3. And just as a PSA, if you haven't seen the first two parts, or a reminder if you have, we are speculating here only on which pre-modern cards might make their way into Modern by way of this set. We're not speculating on what new cards they might design, and we're not really concerned with the financial aspect of reprints for the purpose of this series, only looking for what some cool candidates might be from the older section of the card pool to bring into Modern via MH2. So this is an entirely viewer-driven concluding part of this series. I am responding here and responding to and analyzing suggestions from YouTube comments on the first two videos and also from my Discord channel. So big shout out to people who have submitted cards for me to take a look at here today. And if I did not look at your card here, there's one or two where people suggested a handful of cards. I'm going to look at some of them, but perhaps not all of them. And there were also some suggestions that ended up being reserved list only, so sadly those have to be omitted. If I did miss yours despite it fitting neither of those criteria, I am sorry. I have received hundreds of comments here, and I have done my best to cover them throughout these 3 videos. So with that said, thank you so much for watching. Let's jump right into part 3. A strong card to kick things off here, and one often mentioned in these types of discussions, Shardless Agent. 1 gray, 1 green, 1 blue for an artifact creature, a human rogue, with Cascade, and it is a 2/2. So this is a gray ogre with Cascade, basically. That's an artifact in a different color, right? And this is definitely one that I understand why people want. And remember that with some of these suggestions we're covering here, they were made before the recent bans. I just want to establish that to kick things off. When Uro was still legal, Field of the Dead, Mystic Sanctuary, and maybe some of the comments were made before or after we had Kaldheim unleash Valki upon the format and Tybalt's Trickery as well. So context is necessary, but the individual who submitted this said that Shardless Agent is not more broken than a lot of the cards that I did just mention, which is true, and also is interesting, sends interesting signals relative to Bloodbraid Elf, which I also think is true. Bloodbraid Elf is almost broken in the sense of value just because you are incentivized in decks like Jund and Gruul to play an enormous amount of value-dense, value-generating, or 2-for-1 interaction type of cards, and Bloodbraid into them for a really powerful 3-for-1, whereas the commenter made the case that Shardless Agent, for example, makes low-curve interaction, especially discard spells, better. Makes 1-for-1s better, because nobody's usually trying to design a deck where you're Bloodbraiding into a 1-for-1 spell. Sometimes it can line up, right? Sometimes it can be just what you needed, sometimes it can at least be acceptable, but Shardless Agent with a lower curve is actually more able to be designed alongside 1-mana interaction and have it be desirable Cascade. Now that's very true. Here are some of the countervailing incentives, though, reasons why I'm a little bit skeptical of Shardless Agent. The fact that it is low curve, yeah, it means maybe a Thought Season is on average a better hit, but it also means that you're more able to build around stuff like Ancestral Vision, which, let's be clear, is also in the colors already. So you don't really need to deviate from that like you would to include like a Teamer Bloodbraid deck trying to Bloodbraid into Ancestral Visions. You're pricing yourselves into playing exactly those colors if you do so, and it's not as impressive Bloodbraid on turn 4 into AV as Shardless Agent on turn 3 into AV would be, and also with the base blue you're already more liable to have a good shell for a suspended Ancestral Vision as well, so we have to watch out because Shardless Agent is more able to facilitate those truly busted interactions. You know, some people again think the Bloodbraid Elf stuff is a little bit busted. I would say that Shardless Agent might lend itself better to making 1-for-1 action work in a fair type of way, but also lends itself better to kind of breaking the Cascade mechanic, and we have seen in the very recent past just how dangerous breaking the cascade mechanic can be. And on top of that, let's not forget that you can play both. You can play Temur, you can play Temur Waterfalls, right? Bloodbraid Elf and Shardless Agent together. This is a bit of a recipe for danger. Now, again, maybe Shardless Agent is not quite as powerful as some things that have left the format, and certainly introducing it alongside those seems like a disaster waiting to happen. Some might argue that since we've had so many bans, maybe we could afford to introduce this. I would say I think the risk outweighs the reward for this a little bit. Like, what precisely is this facilitating that does not already exist and is healthy for Modern, like actively healthy? I'm not entirely sure. I think the fail rate of Bloodbraid Elf being a little bit slow. In decks like Ponza, you see its fail rate where it's cascading into Utopia Sprawls and Arbor Elves. In decks like Jund, you see its fail rate when you're cascading into discard when the opponent's Hellbent, or a Fatal Push against a board that does not have an appropriate Fatal Push target. Shardless Agent, because of its lower curve, and perhaps also because of its color pairing, it seems like it has a lower fail rate to me. With that said, I don't think Shardless Agent is something I'm looking for in Modern, but I'm open to alternatives and opinions here. I'm going to lean, though, at the moment, toward no. Next, we have Odyssey's Careful Study. For 1 blue, you draw 2, then discard 2, so this is a color-shifted Faithless Looting without flashback. Or, indeed, it perhaps is more accurate to say Faithless Looting is a color-shifted Careful Study with flashback, right? We all know that Faithless Looting is very, very powerful. Personally, though, I will begin my analysis of this card by saying that I did not mind the looting meta compared to a lot of the other so-called broken metas. To me, the looting meta was far more enjoyable than the Uro meta, far more enjoyable than the Oko meta, and I started playing Modern directly in the aftermath of the Eldrazi winter bans, and I dare say I would have enjoyed the Eldrazi winter a lot less than Faithless Looting as well. So to me, the type of gameplay that a looting type effect generates is not inherently beyond the pale. Now, given all the recent bans, of course, I don't want to unban Faithless Looting in Modern. If we never got any of the fire cards banned, I would definitely be on the fence about that, definitely amenable to arguments regarding that. But Careful Study, my friends, is no Faithless Looting. Number one, it does not have flashback. That is huge, because the first cast of Study, the cast of Study, or I guess the first cast of Looting, is card disadvantage. And I know the decks that really abuse it, it's not usually functionally the case for them, but in a literal sense, and or in the face of disruption, it is still card disadvantage. The fact that looting has flashback means that over the course of a few turns, the disadvantage will work itself out, all else being equal. And that's very, very huge. And of course, the incidental self-mill, the fact that it renders itself halfway immune to discard. Flashback does so much for a card like this. Careful Study does not have it. That in and of itself is a huge nerf. The fact that it is in blue is another actual nerf, because it does not have the extreme density of other enablers. We think of cards like Haggle, which is a relatively recent addition to this type of all-in graveyard enabler, or the old but powerful Cathartic Reunion. Careful Study is in a totally different color, whereas Faithless Looting right along the same color as those other cards, and I would dare say that the interaction in red for these decks is better as well. Cards like Ancient Grudge, which incidentally can be milled into the graveyard, but and cast off of green, of course, but you do still want red as your main color to cast the front half. Cards like Lightning Axe, right? They are enabler and removal at the same time. Careful Study, again, if this is your main engine of the deck, you've got to be deep into blue. You've got to be deep into blue mana production, and that makes it far less of a free roll. I think it would make it far less ubiquitous than Faithless Looting. So those are two pretty significant nerfs from how looting fit into Modern, and also because I'm generally amenable to the type of pressure that looting or similar effects exert on the format, as I said at the beginning of this segment, I'm actually in favor of Careful Study. We could bring back Phoenix this way, in a way that is less domineering, that is more balanced, that has more of a fail rate, and it also doesn't as clearly anywhere near as clearly improve the all-in graveyard decks as an unban of Faithless Looting would. So let me know, as always, what you think about this and all the other ones, but I'm thinking that if I had to make the call here, Careful Study would be entering Modern in MH2. Let's cover Predict next, my friends. A beautiful, beautiful Odyssey printing from Rebecca Guay. We have 1 gray and 1 blue for an instant. Name a card. Then put the top card of target player's library into his or her graveyard. If that card is the named card, you draw 2 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. So we have the floor of a cantrip, the ceiling of a 2-mana draw 2, and along the way, there is an incidental type of mind game and or slight advantage generated in a couple different potential ways via that 1 card of mill. So the mill, of course, can enable one's own graveyard strategies. You can also get lucky and mill a win condition, for example, or a good top deck out of the opponent's deck, right? Especially if they're a combo deck. And also, Predict works pretty well with a lot of cards that do see some play in Modern, and I certainly do not exhaustively know all the synergies, but one thing that obviously comes to mind is Mishra's Bauble. Bauble seeing a lot of play these days as an enabler for Delirium, as a way to churn through the deck. It does a little bit of pseudo-scrying, and of course, more than anything, it is Luris's favorite accessory, right? Favorite necklace to wear, and Predict, obviously, in conjunction with Mishra's Bauble, is going to do a lot of work. There may be other synergies as well. I think this is a card that could also do some have some synergy in a Miracles deck that is interested in the manipulation of the top deck in a couple different ways. So Predict can be both an enabler for that or a payoff as a result of that, right? I think most of the stuff we're talking about is relatively healthy here. I don't think Predict is going to take the format by storm, and if you don't have the luxury of knowledge, Predict will reward those players with a lot of current metagame knowledge. It will reward those with a encyclopedic knowledge of their own list, for example. You can do a little quick mental math and say, okay, what's the best card to blindly predict into right now? And, of course, doing the same for the opponent's deck. That might work as well if the opponent is playing a lot more Foros than you are, for example. So Predict a skill testing card, and a card with a lot of synergies, and a card that is a very unique effect, a very interesting effect in my view, and a totally beautiful original printing. I am in favor of this card entering Modern, with the asterisk, with the caveat that I haven't been shown all of the possible synergies. It could, in theory, there is a world in which it has too many build-arounds. It's far too often a 2-mana draw 2. We don't really want that. We want the card to have more interesting decisions involved upon resolution. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on a really interesting suggestion called Predict. Next up is the infamous Back to Basics. For 2 gray and a blue, you get an enchantment that reads, non-basic lands do not untap during their controller's untap phases. This one is a big no from me. Let me explain why. So I have come to regard Blood Moon, especially in the recent past, with the piles and big mana taking over the format. Blood Moon, while a card I do not love, has become something of a safety valve in Modern, something of a police card, something of a necessary evil. At the same time, Blood Moon is not part of, I hope anybody's really platonic ideal of what Modern should be, certainly not part of mine. I don't think Blood Mooning people out of the game is specifically healthy, but is it a healthy card to counterbalance some of the excesses of other archetypes? I would say at this point I have to admit that it is. But we have, number one, a lot of those archetypes that Blood Moon was trying somewhat unsuccessfully to keep in check have had key cards banned. Number two, in the wake of that, we now have kind of a reset on the piles and a reset on big mana back to something resembling 2018 power level, maybe early 2019, and Cleansing Wildfire is in the format now, which is a very, very powerful tool to be added into the Modern pool as far as really high floor interaction goes against those types of decks, right? So with all of those factors in mind, I don't think we need another Blood Moon style effect in Modern. Maybe if the fire cards were never going to get banned, I would reconsider this, but for now, back to basics is definitely not what we need in terms of policing the format or making the format healthier, in my opinion. And finally, there is definitely some consideration with all of these cards that we're talking about today to keeping the distinct identities between Modern and Legacy very, very healthy and very, very much real, right? So that doesn't mean that any old border card is a Legacy card and anything else is Modern. You know, Predict sees a little bit of play in Legacy as far as I know, does not feel, though, like a format-defining card that is really unique to Legacy's identity. To me, Back to Basics does. So when possible, we should avoid blurring the line between Modern and Legacy. We want to keep the formats feeling like their old selves and being familiar to players who have been around for a while. So that's just another reason we don't want B2B in Modern, if you ask me. Finally, a black card. Jeez, it's been so long. What am I doing here covering all these blue cards? Let's talk about a black one from Urza's Legacy. This is Oppression. 1 gray, 2 black, enchantment. Whenever a player successfully casts a spell, that player chooses and discards a card. Fascinating suggestion. And if I recall correctly, I think this came from a YouTube commenter with the rack as an Avi. So I see you. I see your agenda, my friend. I know where your head's at. You're looking for another 8-rack tool, and that definitely seems like just a great fit for this, right? Beyond that, I don't think it is going to really keep anybody too far down. So one of the classic conundrums of playing hand attack, whether it be traditional discard spells, an all-in strategy like 8-rack, or even considering a planeswalker like Liliana of the Veil in a mid-range deck, is that there is a huge fail rate for those effects when the opponent is already hellbent, when they're ahead on board, especially while also hellbent. These types of effects are terrible top decks, or, you know, the +1 of Liliana can actually hurt you more than it can hurt the opponent in those types of situations. Oppression does not violate that kind of that way in which discard effects kind of police themselves, right? Discard effects can only be so powerful because they have those systemic issues built into them, unless they are deliberately routed around. Oppression does not route around that. It is just more of the same, basically, as far as discard effects go, but in a really unique way. So I point this out because I think that the card is balanced. The card is not going to be too oppressive, despite the name. Don't be afraid, it's not going to be too oppressive in the format. And it's actually pretty cool because you sneak this in under counter magic, for example, against control, and they're not going to be able to keep their hand full against you unless they're just going to make land drops for a long time and then maybe try to go all in on a couple late game turns when they feel the need to finally take some actions. But Oppression is a very interesting effect in that regard, and make no mistake, it is good old-fashioned design, and it is symmetrical. Those two things often go hand in hand. So this is oppressing your own resources in hand just as much as the opponent. So again, a great fit perhaps for 8-rack, which frankly, I don't know exactly how many of these even it could afford. Archetype that could use a boost, right? And conceptually, it is an interesting one to look at because it's kind of like a reverse Phyrexian Arena in a way. It's an enchantment with the exact same mana cost, and then it's kind of doing the opposite thing, right, to what Arena does. So anyway, Oppression, I think we could have this one in Modern. Super cool. I'm a fan. You didn't think I'd go a whole video without talking about elves, did you? We've got Fyndhorn Elves we've got to briefly consider. We've got the beloved and charming but slightly goofy Ice Age printing, which is a great choice. And we've got this absolutely beautiful from the Vault printing as well with the new border, so you've got some really cool aesthetic options for your Fyndhorn Elves. And as much as we've been talking about this and that as far as what could enter Elves in the previous two videos, and also Elves have gotten some nice new toys in Kaldheim, Fyndhorn Elves is really arguably what it would want more than any of the other things, at least in some ways. The Elf deck lives and dies based on its ability to go turn 1 mana dork, and also have a fail rate where if the dork gets bolted to have another one in the back pocket if you're not powering things out ahead of schedule, whatever they might be, whatever your top end cards happen to be, you are not elf balling. And so this will greatly increase the consistency of the Elves deck. Definitely would see some amount of play. Obviously, slots are not free. They're a little hard to come by, in fact, these days, so I don't claim to know exactly what the 60 would look like optimized, but I'm sure Fyndhorn Elves would see play, and I'm all for it, right? It's not doing anything Elves aren't already doing. A little more consistency isn't going to make them unbeatable, far from it, and it's a very, very cool card. I'm, of course, a big fan of Elves in general, so yeah, the only reason I didn't cover this earlier, it's maybe a little bit more of a boring option than something that is a little bit different, like Birchlore Rangers, while filling a similar role. But yeah, Fyndhorn Elves, you gotta give us some kind of Elves in MH2. I'll be happy if it's Birchlore. I'll be happy if it's Fyndhorn. I'll be happy if it's playable. Just give us something. You must, Wizards. You must heed this demand. Another elf to consider, and another beautiful old bordered Rebecca Guay printing is Priest of Titania for 1 gray and 1 green. It's a 1/1 elf with an activated ability, tap to add green to your mana pool for each elf in play. That is a very, very powerful, very high ceiling effect. Is it too powerful for Modern, though? I am on the fence. Certainly when unchecked, it is insane, but you do need it to be unchecked. It is almost a little bit win more, simply because if you have a lot of elves in play to make this great, it is already going okay, at least for you, one assumes. And it's kind of like an Elvish Archdruid without the Anthem. And the Anthem is actually really important in terms of getting over the line and in terms of surviving things like Plague Engineer. However, Priest of Titania, only a 2-drop, so very, very nice for, just enabling more explosive turns involving Heritage Druid or involving them bolting your turn 1 dork, as we mentioned in the previous segment. So ultimately, I think unless they start printing elves that like blowout interaction or do something really, really busted, I think the scope to print even very powerful elves that ultimately do similar things to the elves that already exist in Modern is very high. So while I am willing to entertain discussion here, I suspect, if I had to guess, that if they printed Priest of Titania, it wouldn't be too strong for Modern, not even in the least, and it would also perhaps incentivize some deck building changes to elves. Maybe we move a little bit away from Collected Company here, because it's a marquee 2-drop, not a 3-drop, and the more 3-drops you have, the more Collected Company does for you. If your powerful draws are more centered around, CMC2, maybe not as interested in Coco, and then you have potential for such huge surplus with Priest of Titania that cards that do not cheat cards into play but can accrue you more advantage on average, like Winding Way or Lead the Stampede, even stuff like Realm Walker, become more attractive than Collected Company, again, assuming you're able to go off on a somewhat routine basis. So in that sense, Priest of Titania is very interesting, just a very charming and heartwarming card. I do love myself some old bordered elves, my friends. Priest of Titania, hey, let's at least consider her for Modern. Next up is a really cool instant from Odyssey, which if it wasn't before this video, which it was, it would rapidly become one of my favorite blocks just on the basis of some of the really cool cards we're looking at. This is Divert. It is a blue instant, 1 mana, change the target of a target spell with a single target, unless that spell's controller pays 2. So the obvious card to compare this to is Spell Pierce, because it's got the same casting cost, would fit kind of the same style of role, but Divert has 2-for-1 potential, whereas Spell Pierce does not, because you can do the classic, you're not going to bolt me, you're going to bolt your own creature. That type of play with Divert is very much live. The big downside, of course, relative to Spell Pierce, is that it is more reactive than an already purely reactive card, simply because you have to wait for maybe the optimal target, or maybe even a target at all. Spell Pierce can counter Planeswalkers on curve. That is arguably the single biggest difference here, but also artifacts and enchantments and so on and so forth that Divert cannot. Spell Pierce also not exactly seeing an enormous amount of play in Modern, so just judging it on that comparison alone, I think Divert could actually be perfectly safe for Modern. Definitely not going to set the world on fire. Might end up being like a cute fun of in some of these more traditional control decks that are able to emerge in the wake of the bans, or provide some really interesting counterplay, high ceiling counterplay to be exact, in certain types of situations. So yeah, if I'm missing something big with this card that it can accomplish, I'm willing to accept that. Assuming that's not the case, I think Divert would be just fine. Hey, while we're at it, let's look at another card that kind of fits along the curve in the same place that a Spell Pierce would. This is Disrupt. Counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 1, draw a card. So, on the one hand, we have a much, much, much worse Spell Pierce or Mana Tithe style effect, however you want to look at it. It's kind of like a bad version of either. It's worse than both, basically, in pretty significant ways. On the other hand, it cantrips, right? So it's worse at the counter job, but it can be a tempo play that slows the opponent down while you draw a card, especially if your deck is already inherently advantaged on tempo, right? Because if you can use each point of mana more efficiently than they can, a 1-for-1 mana trade, basically a 1-for-1 tempo trade, will favor you. Of course, the theory with this card is that it has the high ceiling of being able to actually hard counter the opponent's spell because they're tapped out when they cast it, and cantrip, the good old Veil of Summer mode, right? The good old 1-mana cryptic command mode. I am leery, my friends, of cards that say draw a card when they have such a low casting cost. I am very, very leery, and even though this card is extremely reactive, with the types of decks that would play it, eventually they will get to the point at the end of the game, or even in the mid-game, right? Let's say it's turn 3. And, the opponent's not really looking likely to present a good window for Disrupt. Well, you just, opt and disrupt your own opt and draw and then opt again. It's really not that bad, right? You untap, you'll be good to go. So, Disrupt, I am leery of it because it cantrips. It's got a very, very high ceiling. That said, it's an interesting card. It is worth mentioning. Of course, just like the previous card we looked at, Divert, Disrupt is doing nothing against Planeswalkers, against other permanents at all, basically. This is purely trying to win stack wars, or at least win advantageous stack battles in moments that can help you win the war in the long game. I probably wouldn't print this into Modern before some other cards just because the feel-bads would be pretty feel-bad, but ultimately, would this break Modern? Yeah, I kinda doubt it. Another epic Odyssey card, even with the gravestone, the tombstone icon next to the name, which they have brought back, my friends, in Time Spiral Remastered, by the way. Very, very epic. But this is Recoup from Odyssey. It is a sorcery for 1 red and 1 gray. Target sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. Its flashback cost is equal to its mana cost, and then Recoup itself has flashback for 4, 3 gray, and a red. So this is kind of, it was described as a red Snapcaster style effect. Obviously, that is not strictly true. Snapcaster has flash. It also has the high floor of being flashed in as a beater, and even if you're using it to flash back a sorcery specifically, it is still leaving a 2-1 body behind, which on average is probably better or at least more efficient than the card itself having flashback as Recoup does. However, this is definitely, those are some reasons why this card would be safe, right? It's not exactly setting the world on fire, despite what is depicted in the art. Everything about this just very, very cool. At the same time, it provides a pretty unique effect for red, and it would also in turn incentivize some pretty unique deck building decisions. Like if we look at like a Rakdos mid-range deck, well, your sorceries get a little bit better, Dreadbore becomes maybe more desirable than Terminate, all else being equal. I think a card like Collective Brutality actually has some real synergies with Recoup, because being able to repeatedly flashback cards in general is nice. It is a form of card selection, not just advantage, which is important to understand for a deck like Rakdos that might otherwise lack it to a significant degree. And of course, with Brutality in specific, you can escalate this card You can escalate Recoup itself to a really aggressive early brutality, and then have a late game flashback waiting in the graveyard. But any deck that would play this is probably already using their graveyard as well. You have Kroxa as the number one example, just exiling your whole graveyard and doing very powerful things. This is a lot more tame compared to that, so it also maybe opens you up a little bit more to hate, because in the face of graveyard hate, this does nothing, unlike Snapcaster Mage, so I think this card is really cool. I think it's really safe for Modern, and I think it could just sneak in to see a little bit of cute play depending on the meta and depending on the shell, so I think this is a great suggestion. I'm in for it. Next, let's look at the missing 40% of the Seal of cycle. We have the blue Seal of Removal, a 1-drop enchantment where you can sack Seal of Removal to unsummon, to return target creature to its owner's hand. So mostly a worse unsummon, which sees no play at all. And also we have Seal of Cleansing, which is a color-shifted Seal of Primordium. This is a white enchantment, 1 gray, 1 white, sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Again, mostly a worse disenchant, but these cards do specifically have synergies with things where the graveyard matters, whether you just want to grow a Tarmogoyf with different types in the graveyard that are unusual, or indeed with Lurrus of the Dream Den to loop them, and that is arguably the most significant use case of the Seal of Cycle. The other 3 colors that the Seal of Cycle comprises are already legal in Modern. Seal of Fire is the only one that sees widespread play, of course. This is very good alongside Lurrus in the right shell, and you also have Seal of Primordium, which occasionally a Lurrus BGX player might reach for loopable, naturalize effects, and Seal of Doom exists as well. None of these cards are breaking Modern. Seal of Removal and Seal of Cleansing are weaker on average than Seal of Fire, and probably Seal of Primordium is a more relevant color to be in than Seal of Cleansing, but could be wrong about that. In any case, it would be cool to complete this cycle. These are interesting cards to have access to, obviously very, very safe for Modern as well. Next up is Planar Void. Speaking of some 1-mana enchantments, this is a black enchantment that has a Leyline of the Void symmetrical effect, basically. It reads, whenever a card is put into a graveyard, remove that card from the game. So just to address an issue in terms of how this would work with the rules, it does usually beat the Dredge payoffs, for example, because when the Dredge player goes off on their turn, their triggers will go on the stack first, and then the Planar Void triggers from the non-active player, aka you facing the Dredge player, will go on the stack second and therefore will resolve first. So Planar Void, a good hate piece, a very good hate piece, and it is definitely interesting as an alternative to Leyline of the Void for maybe decks that don't want to mulligan so deeply and so aggressively to their own hate cards, to decks that want to play a more value-oriented game, but at the same time, Planar Void is symmetrical, and most of those decks that don't want to mulligan aggressively do actually use their own graveyard as a resource. I've had Tarmogoyfs get really huge despite my own Leyline of the Void on the battlefield because my own graveyard is still thriving, right? Planar Void, under a turn 1 Planar Void, that is not going to happen, of course, and also it has the same problem as a hardcast Leyline of the Void, although it can come down a lot earlier, of course, in that it doesn't clean up what's already there, nor does it cantrip, nor does it really do anything else. So if the opponent removes it, you're basically could still be in big trouble, unlike a card like Rest in Peace, which will, upon resolution, have the trigger that wipes the graveyards, and then will continue to keep the graveyards on lock until it is dealt with. So Planar Void, in a couple different ways, I think is pretty safe. That said, it's still a very powerful effect, especially because it can be hard cast for 1. I'm thinking of shells that don't really exist so much yet, or shells that could use a boost. Something like 8-Rack, maybe this makes more sense than Leyline, maybe not. Probably not, actually, but it's hard for me to say. But if you're looking at, how it pairs with a card like Dark Confidant, it's a much less painful flip, just as one example, and of course much better to hardcast than Leyline ever could be. So Planar Void, I think, is a very powerful effect, but one that is not going to have any danger of homogenizing graveyard hate. I think overall, it kind of exists in a weird null zone between Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, and then of course you have the more value value-neutral options like Nile Spellbomb, Soul Guide Lantern. There's a whole lot of graveyard hate going around. This could be an interesting addition that probably won't push anything else too far out of the format. Next up is an old-fashioned split card from Apocalypse, for which maybe I should have found a rotated image, sorry about that, but this is Fire and Ice, maybe you already know what it does. We have the red half and the blue half both costing 1 gray plus 1 color, and Fire is the red half. It is a forked bolt at instant speed, basically, dealing 2 damage divided as you choose, right, between any number of targets. Ice is a blue instant, tap target permanent, draw a card. So Ice is a tempo play, right? And together, the cards cover a whole lot of bases, right? And for those who don't know how the old-fashioned split cards work, you're not casting both. It's not Fuse. It's not an MDFC. I mean, you're casting only one, right? You're just picking one and casting it. That's basically, it's one of the most intuitive kind of split style cards that we've ever seen. Go figure, right? Back in the day, it was a little more intuitive. So these two halves, though, cover your bases pretty well. Fire, of course, being very, very good when the opponent is on a small creature deck and or when you are the aggressor, right? Every point of damage mattering, and Ice, very, very important when the opponent is perhaps trying to do something more busted than that, more busted than you are. Tapping target permanent is a really powerful tempo play, for example, against Tron. Note that it does not say tap target non-land permanent, and you are always drawing a card, so Ice is a little bit of a way to delay the game while you dig toward what you need to really win it, and or to accrue tempo advantage, while Fire is a good tool against small creature decks, and I think there could be a world in which an effect like this that, as I say, covers so many bases so well is overpowered, but realistically in Modern, I don't think this is overpowered, and it probably slots into decks that, frankly, we do want to see a little bit more of, like fair, interactive, Jeskai, or Izzet style control decks. Fire and Ice could be a really nice tool for those decks, and I don't see it being too much of a terror beyond that. Now, from Torment, we have Rancid Earth for 1 gray and 2 black. It is a sorcery that reads destroy target land, so this is just like Rain of Tears. Except there is a threshold ability, threshold of course being there if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, so mid to late game depending on your shell, and depending on the opponent's interaction of course, but threshold instead, destroy that land and Rancid Earth deals 1 damage to each creature and each player, so this is very in keeping with old black design where it does have the ability to wrath away weenies. In more modern design with this color, we don't see that as often. In that sense, Rancid Earth is a real throwback, and it's actually really cool because unlike any other land destruction effect, basically, it does a second thing. It can sweep up weenies, and that's actually really interesting. It can open up some lines of play where you're basically, maybe you are incentivized to register this in your sideboard instead of a Fulminator Mage or instead of something even more powerful than that, depending on your colors, because, you know, you can kind of cover 2 bases with it. You can have a slow, but still perhaps a relevant way to destroy the opponent's X1s. If you are bringing this in, and the land destruction would be secondary in those matchups, or of course it is your Rain of Tears with potential upside as well. So Rancid Earth, a fascinating card in this regard. I don't think it's at all too powerful, but I will make the same caveat I've made with Sinkhole and other land destruction spells. You have to be very careful about printing them because you don't want a Black Ponza deck to form. You don't want a critical mass of these things where land destruction is the number 1 win condition. But leaving that concern aside, Rancid Earth, a pretty cool idea if you ask me. Now let's look at Impulse. For 1 gray and 1 blue, it's an instant. This is from Visions. It's a very iconic old Magic card. The art is very disturbing in a way that blue art is normally not these days. I do think it's super cool. And the text box reads, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom, and then shuffle your library afterwards. So Impulse is a card selection spell, basically. For 2 mana, you get to dig 4 deep, pick the best one, and then it's all blind from there. Your next draw is blind, you are shuffling after. So a lot of people do request this card when things like this come up. To me, I think it's fine, because I've listed all the reasons I like it already, and I don't think it is too powerful for Modern. Frankly, not not even close. Maybe I'm underestimating the card, right? But one card, and I'm not a blue mage, so there might be better comparisons to make, but one card that came to my mind is Telling Time. And Telling Time sees like no play in Modern, but Telling Time I think is a more powerful card overall than Impulse, especially in certain shells. Telling Time, you only dig 3 deep, otherwise it's the identical kind of dig of Impulse, but crucially with Telling Time, after you've looked at the top 3, one goes into your hand just like with Impulse, one goes on top of your library, which is huge. Which is huge for Miracles especially, but frankly for any type of deck that would play this type of effect. Setting up your next draw is completely amazing, and then one goes on the bottom of your library, so whatever the worst card of the 3 is, you will see hide nor hair of it, at least until the next time you have to shuffle, right? And this card, again, doesn't really see play, so to me, a card that sees no play like Telling Time looks more powerful on average in most shells that would want this effect than Impulse. So with that in mind, I think Impulse could be still an interesting tool for people to reach for depending on the shell if they care more about getting what they want now rather than setting up to play, to have the advantage in successive turns. Maybe Impulse enables combo a little bit more this way. It's hard to tell. But to me, this is a very safe and very cool printing. Let's have it. And next is a card that I absolutely do not want and completely oppose, Baleful Strix. And we're not going to get it either. This is the same reason we're not getting Cabal Therapy. They have already created what they deem to be modern-worthy versions of these cards in the form of Icefang Quattle and Cabal Therapist, respectively. But Strix is a 2-drop blue-black artifact bird, flying, Death Touch, ETB, draw a card. This card sucks. It's really strong, but it sucks in terms of what it does to a format, in my opinion. You are completely invalidating mid-range beaters, and to a lesser extent, you are invalidating traditional aggro decks. What I mean by this is that mid-range decks, shadow decks, these want to trade 1 for 1 and then have a very high card quality. And the cards that actually turn sideways to win them the game are cards like Tarmogoyf, Scourge of the Skyclaves, and Death Shadow. I think this is some of the healthiest gameplay Magic has to offer. Baleful Strix completely invalidates those because it trades with any of them in combat, and it draws a card. And people don't think this is that big a deal, but it is a big deal. You are invalidating mid-range efficient beaters in a very, very big way with this card because you are almost putting yourself at a disadvantage if you're playing an interactive deck and not playing Strix. So the Strix decks, they send the incentive to do the Strix thing instead of the Goyf thing or the Shadow thing, and then these decks cannot police big mana or combo effectively because they're trying to clock with a 1-1 instead of with a 4-5 or a 7-7 or whatever it's going to be. So Baleful Strix, definitely not. No thank you. No sir. Now, I think the mention of Strix came from Discord user Deathrite Ben, who we love, so now, although that was my harshest rebuttal yet of any of the cards we've covered, I'm going to cover another of Ben's suggestions in the form of No Mercy, which I think we should have, and which I think is a really interesting selection. It is a black enchantment. 2 gray, 2 black mana. Whenever a creature successfully deals damage to you, destroy it. So this is a fascinating card, because you are doing a lot that, black mid-range decks like to do, in that you have a difficult-to-answer piece that is going to repeatedly remove the creatures that the opponent is throwing at you. That said, you're not removing them before they deal the damage, so the opponent can still kill you through an unanswered No Mercy just by turning every creature they have into a deal whatever their power is, right? Kind of like a bad burn deck. They can still beat you that way. At the same time, No Mercy is really, really interesting because it is a very unique way to not only X for 1 the opponent at the cost of some of your own life total, or maybe the opponent getting on hit procs, even worse. But also, this is a way around hexproof stuff. This is a way around Bogles. The Bogle hits you once, and then it's done for. No mercy to the Bogles. So definitely a very, very intriguing one. I don't think it's probably powerful enough to really see any play, but it is a unique enough effect that I think it could be an interesting candidate for printing, and who knows, maybe a safety valve in some ways against something truly uninteractable with. It also, I will say before we move on, reminds me of Vengeful Pharaoh, which you used to see as a one-of in Dredge decks, which is kind of cool. You know, if Pharaoh's in your graveyard, you get kind of a No Mercy style effect, but it is different. Pharaoh goes back on top of your library, you're targeting an attacking creature, which is bad against the aforementioned stuff, and also Pharaoh, of course, can be hardcast as a 5/4 Death Touch. There's no such upside there with No Mercy, so again, I think this card's totally safe, but a really cool one. Let's see if we can get it in MH2. Another really cool idea is the Planeshift Familiar cycle. So you have basically monocolored familiars that are 1/1s for 2 with moderate upsides relative to that baseline that are cost reducers for 2 other colors. So we have Thunderscape Familiar here with First Strike reducing red, reducing black and green. We have Thornscape Familiar, which is a native 2/1, green, reducing red and white. We have Sunscape Familiar, which sees some Pauper play, which is an 0/3 and a wall, white, reducing green and blue. We have Stormscape Familiar, which is a flyer. It's blue, reducing white and black. And we also have Nightscape Familiar, which has a regenerate ability. And it is a black card, reducing blue and red. And it was pointed out that Storm is an interesting shell specifically for this one, maybe, simply because blue and red spells both getting reduced is kind of cool. If people were in the market for a 9th plus cost reducer and were also willing to splash black for Grixis Storm, which I don't know if either of those things will ever really be true, but you understand the point. You know, there could be interesting homes for these. They could also enable other heretofore unconceived of shells simply because that cross-color cost reduction is definitely interesting. That said, these types of creatures that die to a stiff breeze that are also 2-drops and then you're trying to cost reduce it just tends to always be a little bit too cute to see play in Modern. We see like the Banneret style cards doing nothing, for example, and the only real exception is Storm with its more focused cost reducers, right? But anyway, the Familiar cycle, not going to hurt anything, could give rise to some jank that could definitely see a little bit of play, and generally speaking, they're pretty cool and iconic cards, so why not? Next up, I'd like to look at some Fallen Empires lands, which for me are so nostalgic. I used to play these cards kitchen table all the time back in elementary school, and you love to see them again. Ebon Stronghold, one of my favorites. Ruins of Trocaire, also another. And as you can see, I just choosing based on aesthetics. They are both so cool. This whole cycle is actually very cool and done by Mark Poole, a great old school Magic landscape artist. But basically, we've had Simian Spirit Guide banned in Modern, right? So these are ETB tapped lands that you can tap, you know, to basically use them as a forest without the type or whatever the color might be, or you can sacrifice them to add 2 mana of that color to your mana pool. So we are definitely doing a little bit of a fast mana thing in kind of an ad nauseum way in terms of like you're not getting a dork down, you're not getting a rock down that you can immediately and repeatedly use. You're slowing down now to speed up later on one turn where you need a big burst. And these cards are pretty bad, don't get me wrong. But I do wonder if some kind of ramp like this that as a land is difficult to interact with, and I don't know if there's any kind of synergy here with Amulet of Vigor or something like that. Probably not, right? But you could definitely see these cards being an interesting little niche just in case they enable something that does not already exist. It is hard to say. You do have to say that these days, with lands that have upsides, when you sacrifice them, we also have to wonder whether Renin 6 specifically is liable to abuse them. Given the fact that they ETB tapped, I kind of doubt it, but it is still worth mentioning. You also have other ways to buy it back, like Crucible of Worlds, Ramanop Excavator, you guys get it. Ultimately, I think these cards are too janky to see play, but they are within the scope, I think, of mentioning here in this video. If nothing else, if you didn't know they existed, look how cool they are. I hope that made your day a little bit better. Next, let's briefly look at the invasion cycle of lands, which kind of have the same energy as the Fallen Empire's lands and the familiar cycle from Planeshift combined, because these are ETB tapped lands that you can, once they untap, can function more or less as a normal land, but then you sacrifice them to add 2. But this is not monocolored like the Fallen Empire's ones are. These are cross-colored, so you have Geothermal Crevice, which is kind of the Jund invasion land, taps to add red, or sacks to add Golgari for 2, 1 black and 1 green. And these are really cool lands with some legendary artists like John Avon and Rob Alexander. We have Ancient Spring from Don Hazeltine. We have this Alexander Irrigation Ditch. We've got Sulfur Vent from Edward P. Beard Jr., and we've got Tinder Farm. These lands are very, very cool, if you ask me. I love this type of landscape art so much. And, I don't have anything really more to say about them than I did about the Fallen Empire's lands. But once again, the only real possible concerns with these are Wrenn and 6 Synergy or Amulet of Vigor that I can see. Otherwise, you're looking at basically slow, fast mana. And the fast mana comes at a severe disadvantage, as well as the early disadvantage of ETB tapped. So, kind of doubt these would see play, but they are cool. They do exist. Maybe worth mentioning. Well, if you thought the ETB tap lands were too bad to play, how about some Ice Age lands that don't even produce mana, right? We have Glacial Chasm and Ice Floe that fit this description. Also Halls of Mist as well, which is kind of a cumulative upkeep, ensnaring bridge style effect that doesn't care about cards in your hand, but Halls is on the reserve list, so we will set that one aside. Just felt weird not mentioning it for the sake of completion, but Ice Floe and Glacial Chasm could both enter Modern. Now, Glacial Chasm we'll talk about first. Again, these lands do not produce mana, not even colorless. So you use up your land drop for a turn, and you can never tap them for anything, except if Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth is in play. So do remember that Urborg adds some really interesting dimensions to these decks, assuming that Urborg is something you could already justify. But Glacial Chasm, cumulative upkeep 2 life, which is very, very hefty. But when Glacial Chasm comes into play, sacrifice a land. Okay, that's also a very hefty price. So what does it do? You cannot attack. Okay, also bad. 0 for 3, but all damage dealt to you is reduced to 0. Now, this is an extraordinarily powerful effect, and it is definitely something that could, in theory, stall long enough for a combo to go off, or for a lock to be set up, or for an overwhelming board state to be assembled, but you wouldn't want to include this just as a matter of course. It could definitely be a build around something specific, or, unfortunately, it could maybe be a toolbox card in some of the Titan decks or other big mana decks. Maybe that would be a little bit arguably less of a healthy use case. It is hard for me to say. I do have a bias against those decks, so maybe disregard that. But we do also have to remember that you can choose not to pay the upkeep. This card will go to the graveyard, which does mean it has some kind of synergy, again, with Wrenn and 6, maybe Life from the Loam as well. This could be a bit of an annoying lock, to say the least, in consideration with cards like that. And then there is combo with Solemnity, at least combo potential with Solemnity. You're not able to get counters on this card for cumulative upkeep. I believe that's how this works, and therefore it is kind of a soft lock, but Solemnity locks exist in general. Glacial Chasm comes at a huge opportunity cost to include. Ultimately, is this type of gameplay healthy? I'm not sure. It's probably very annoying to face, but it is fascinating in the way that only a very old Magic card can be. So I remain agnostic on this. People who have maybe played around with it in different contexts can be more decisive here, but I thought to mention it. And Ice Floe, a little bit easier to grok. It is a card that, once again, uses up your land drop, but does not actually produce mana unless it is alongside an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. And you also may choose not to untap Ice Floe during your untap phase. So all this does, activated ability, tap target creature without flying that is attacking you. As long as Ice Floe remains tapped, that creature does not untap during its controller's untap phase. And this is kind of cool. Big shout out to the Dogfish who used to use this on the kitchen table against me all the time, and it's a really interesting card. Again, I don't have a strong opinion on it either way. I think this one is a lot more obvious like, not broken than something like we just looked at, Glacial Chasms, but Ice Floe, definitely a really unique effect. I could see this being really cool. I do admittedly have a soft spot for these old-fashioned lands that don't produce mana. Again, the opportunity cost is very, very high, rendering them both unique and more or less inherently balanced, with the synergies we just mentioned perhaps accepted. So we've been mentioning Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth as the synergy card, and here it is. I'm sure you all know what it does, but there it is in case you didn't. But what about the original Urborg? Did you know this card existed? Urborg. No Tomb of Yawgmoth, just Urborg. Legendary land from the set Legends. It enters untapped. You tap it to add a swamp, or a black mana, and you can also tap it to remove first strike ability or swamp walk ability from target creature until end of turn. I love this cycle. I think it's so delightful. There's Hammerheim, there's some other ones, but Urborg is definitely a very, very cool one, and obviously this is not going to break anything. I think it's super cool, and it gets even cooler than it already was with the old border, with the name, with the set that it comes from. If you look at the Edgar Allan Poe flavor text, who loves this, right? If you are anything like me, you really miss this classical literary flavor text, and Urborg brings it with a vengeance. Have you had enough of Urborg yet? Well, of course not. How about some good old-fashioned Urborg Justice? For black, you get an instant from Weatherlight with epic art, but it gets better. Target opponent chooses and buries a number of creatures he or she controls equal to the number of creatures put into your graveyard from play so far this turn. So this is a fascinating kind of reversal potential in the kind of back and forth mid-range mirror style of interaction. More realistically, it could definitely be some real powerful interaction in a deck that seeks to put their own cards into the graveyard for whatever reason, an aristocrat shell maybe comes to mind, maybe some all-in graveyard stuff. It is just fascinating. It is just really, really interesting in terms of the design, and of course it does route around these hexproof style effects as well, because, well, not hexproof for the opponent, but hexproof for their threats, because you target the opponent, and then the opponent has to choose. So I don't know exactly if this card would see much play. It might be a little bit of the type of design they think they've moved away from, but to me that's what makes it great. So pretty cool card. If you have any cool use cases for this one, of course, leave them in the comments below. We have not covered enough white cards in this series, my friends, so let's wind it down by looking at a couple from the dark. Holy Light from the dark, an instant for 2 gray and 1 white. All non-white creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. Now, I'm not exactly in the market for more X1 hate. I think that is already quite significant in Modern, right? But Holy Light is a pretty unique effect, kind of emblematic of that era in a couple different ways. I do really love the understated art, and also the fact that this can also be a combat trick rather than a static hate piece. For example, Plague Engineer, of course, post-combat Plague Man is kind of a combat trick too, but Holy Light is an intra-combat combat trick. Yeah, that is what I'm trying to say, believe it or not. And therefore can be really interesting. I do like these cards that can see play in creature decks while being sweeper-ish. You know what I mean? I think that's a really unique place to be in. It's definitely not going to destroy the format in any way, shape, or form. So Holy Light, kind of one to mention, right? I like to look back at the ancient periods of Modern for interesting cards that are also not on the RL. This is one of them, if you ask me. And lastly, another white card from that same set that does have more obvious applications is Dust to Dust. It's a sorcery for 1 gray and 2 white, exiles 2 target artifacts, right? Or as it is phrased here, removes 2 target artifacts from the game. So I think I think this in many ways set the tone for white, right? It has the same energy maybe as Force of Vigor, with the inability to force it out of your hand, but also a lower hard-casted cost, but more importantly, it also exiles. And again, white has become the exile color in Modern by far, and Dust to Dust kind of doubles down on that effect while also reaching back in time, and it is going to be a 2-for-1 under a whole lot of circumstances. At the same time, it's not something that cannot be recovered from. It's not more all or nothing like a Shatterstorm or a hard hate piece that they either do or do not answer, like Collector Roof or Stony Silence. So nothing wrong with an effect like this, in my opinion. It's going to be difficult probably to justify playing it right now, but could be a good safety valve for if artifacts get a little bit out of control. So there it is, friends. There is the final piece of this mini-series on MH2 speculation. As I said at the beginning, I tried to cover everybody's comments, basically, whether they were on YouTube or Discord, and there were a couple that I did choose not to cover, and there were others that maybe I missed. If it's the latter, sorry about that. But in general, I know I got 95% of people's suggestions featured over the course of these 3 videos, and we could do this forever, right? There are so many old cards to talk about. I tried to give you mostly realistic ones, or even if I don't perceive them to be realistic, at least ones that people talk about a lot, and also give you some more esoteric ones, right, that probably won't see a ton of play, but they could find a niche, and whether or not that is true, they are at least very, very cool. And this is just right along the lines of what I wanted to do, because this is a very, very fun subject to look at for me. So thank you for all your ideas, thank you for watching, and I'll see you for the next video. Hope everybody out there has a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon.